Okay, everybody, welcome to today's talk as part of the World Issues Forum. Before we begin, I'd like to say a land acknowledgement. Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared land and waterways. Okay, now I'm going to introduce today's speaker. And I'd also like to note that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Ray Walpole Institute, the Center for Canadian American Studies, Department of Political Science, and the Foundation for WW and Alumni. Okay, so we're so pleased to have with us Laurie Trautman, the director of the Border Policy Research Institute here at Western. She engages in a range of research activities focused on the US-Canada border and the Cascadia region between Washington State and British Columbia. And we've read several of her recommended readings and essays in preparation for this talk. So we are very excited. Thank you, Laurie.
Thanks. Okay. Make sure that we get that going. I'll introduce myself. Happy to be here, everybody. My name is Laurie Trautman. I have been at Western for about 11 years. Before I came here to work at the Border Policy Research Institute, I came as an undergrad all the way from New Jersey. I graduated high school, drove cross country, and showed up in Bellingham. And I was really drawn to Western for its interdisciplinary programs, things like Fairhaven College and College of the Environment. I had family up in Vancouver, Canada, so I ended up here. Also really wanted to get out of New Jersey, and I have not gone back since. I left Western in 2000-ish and traveled around, did my master's in Montana and finished my PhD at the University of Oregon, and then found myself back here to work at what's called BPRI. I had actually never intended to come back to Bellingham or come back to Western, but really happy to be here. It's been about 11 years now. So I've spoken at the World Issues Forum a number of years ago. My institute sponsors whoever we can. I think you saw Hiroshi Matamura last week. We sponsored his talk. So always happy to be involved in World Issues Forum, and I think it's great that you all can be here today. So as the talk gets kind of ready, I thought I would just sort of introduce maybe BPRI very quickly, because we're a very small program. Many students don't know about us. We were created about 20 years ago out of a partnership between US Senator Patty Murray and a political science professor, Don Alper. And they created this program largely because after the events of 9/11, the terrorist attacks, the Canada-US border was really kind of fundamentally altered. It became much more difficult to cross the border. It became more difficult for people to have their lives spanning that border. And so they really wanted to have a research institute dedicated to understanding the impact of that border on our state's economy, but also on our families and our communities, especially here in Whatcom County, because we are so close to the border. So our main mission is to conduct policy relevant research that minimizes the friction of the border. So improves cross-border mobility, improves cross-border collaboration for a variety of reasons. And I can say that I stand here today having never imagined what we would be dealing with on the Canada-US border that we are. I've spent really since February pretty much of this year, just trying to understand this whole new world of Canada-US relations, which is not a good situation right now. I'll talk a little bit about tariffs and some of these issues, but what I wanted to do was kind of take a step back from the immediate politics of the day and the things that we're dealing with on the border and look back a little bit to how COVID, I think, laid the groundwork for a lot of what we're seeing today. So when we think about crises and borders as political theater, I'm going to explain to you what I mean by that. But I think when we think about events that could be considered crises or emergencies, a lot of things come to mind, right? We think about fentanyl crisis, the COVID public health crisis, a migrant crisis, and you could choose, I could put air quotes behind all of these terms because how we define a crisis is very subjective, right? But a crisis is basically a form of an emergency. And that necessitates some kind of action or some kind of adaptation. Might be a policy response, might be a change in behavior, but regardless, a crisis sort of lends itself to feelings of fear and a desire for protection. Often in times of crisis, people will turn to their governments for that protection. Maybe that's not how we feel right now, but typically that's sort of the situation. We turn to our governments to implement a solution to a crisis. But developing solutions is usually very complex. Very rarely is there sort of one policy mechanism that can solve a crisis. Think about drug addiction or migration. There isn't sort of one way to solve that problem. It's very complex. However, if a crisis at hand is framed as a threat that's coming from outside of the country, outside of the nation's borders, then governments have a very simple and visible way of showing that they can keep their citizens and residents safe. Borders, right? The political theater of borders. So what I mean by political theater is borders are this physical space, this platform where governments can show their people that they are doing something to protect them. If a migrant crisis is a concern about too many people crossing a nation's borders, the solution is to close the border, right? If a trade crisis, like what we're dealing with now, again, crisis in quotes, is about other countries taking advantage of the US, then erecting tariffs to restrict the cross-border movement of goods can be seen as a solution. So there's this element of political theater that's enacted when governments use this over-reliance on borders or sort of a borders-first approach as a policy response to various crises. It's a very visible demonstration of protecting those that belong in a country from the things that maybe are considered not to belong in the country, or from things that are considered to be a perceived threat. The problem, of course, is that borders are a very overly simplistic response to these challenges that require much more nuance. And there's also a lot of collateral damage associated with a borders first response. This has long been true for migrants, right? We know a lot of situations and stories of how migrants have fared very ill at our border crossings. But the sort of topic I'd like to dig into today is that this is increasingly true, not just for foreigners or for migrants, but for citizens and residents. And it's particularly the case for communities in borderland areas such as ours. All right, perfect timing. So a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. And I also want to say, if at any point you have a question or a comment, feel free to raise your hand. We can make this more informal than me just sort of talking at you for 45 minutes. I'm more than happy to make it more conversational. So I'm going to start out by looking back again at the COVID-19 pandemic and the expansion of borders as a response to emergencies and crises. And this is just an image up here from a book that I wrote with a colleague here at Western named Ted Alden. He's at the College of Business and Economics. And Ted and I wrote this book because we saw the use of borders globally around the world during COVID as really this warning sign for what we might see to come in the sort of policy toolbox of governments, which is going first to borders, going first to this sort of nationalistic anti-foreigner approach to solve problems during crises. Of course, we had no idea that the Trump administration would get elected and we would be seeing this play out as quickly as it is in the United States. But this is really a global phenomenon. So in the book, we traveled around the world. We spoke to a lot of people. I'm going to share some of their stories with you. But really, we wanted to look at the impact of people's lives to the use of borders in these contexts, and really sort of explore COVID as a way that governments sort of tested out how far they could go with restricting their borders during a crisis and during a response. And what I think we found, and what I'll talk a little bit about, is that COVID really did sort of lay the groundwork for what we're seeing today, for an increasing use of borders to address a growing range of crises that often have actually little to do with borders, and crises in which borders are not actually the appropriate solutions. Then I will shift sort of away from that broader view to look at the politicization of the Canada-US border. And this is really something that has its roots, I would argue, in the COVID pandemic, perhaps in the first Trump administration, but coming out of COVID is when we really started to see the politicization of the Canada-US border leading up to the 2024 presidential election. And then, of course, today, the Canada-US border is this incredibly hot button issue that really 2 or 3 years ago was a sleepy topic. And then finally, I'll just wrap up with a little bit of where we are today, a little bit of how Whatcom County is actually being impacted by these broader politics. I don't have great solutions or great answers, but I do have a few sort of hopeful points to end on. So hopefully I don't leave you with sort of a Debbie Downer situation. All right, let's see. So sort of backing up into COVID. At the outset of the pandemic, there was a lot of multilateral agreements across the world. There was the World Health Organization, the European Commission, of course, has a Schengen area of free movement, which you may be familiar with. It's passport-free travel and between the member states. The United States actually had an agreement with Mexico and with Canada that if there was a major pandemic or influenza, we would not actually close our land borders. So all of these multilateral arrangements sort of pointed in one direction, which was that borders are not the solution to stopping a global pandemic because we live in a very globalized world. Quotes such as this from the World Health Organization: blanket travel bans will not prevent international spread, and they will place a heavy burden on lives and livelihoods. In addition, they can adversely impact global health efforts during a pandemic. So there was 116 or 196 countries that agreed to limit the use of border restrictions, and yet pretty much every single one restricted their borders at the outset of the pandemic. So even though border restrictions were unsupported by existing health evidence and contradicted multilateral agreements, over 140 countries implemented them. So a little bit of a visual, just to give you a sense, the countries in the darker colors are countries that had heavily restricted their borders. By April 2020, 90% of the world's population was living in countries with some kind of border restriction. And almost half of those countries had a complete ban on people entering who were not citizens or permanent residents. These varied widely. Mexico on the books had border restrictions, but in theory, you could basically travel there as sort of normal throughout the pandemic. And then places like Japan refused the reentry of their own permanent residents coming from certain countries. So they were sort of all over the place, but one common theme was that even though countries restricted the mobility of people, trade continued to flow. And this was a pretty critical component of sort of allowing commerce to continue. Many countries did something where they designated travel that was essential versus travel that was non-essential. Very few, if any, actually defined what that meant. These were very nebulous categories. In the case of the US and Canada, it actually sort of depended on the border agent that you got when you arrived at the border as to whether or not your trip was considered essential or non-essential. So you could imagine if you had an elderly parent on the other side of the border, or a family or some sort of relative that you were responsible for giving care to, you might not know if you could cross the border that day to care for that relative. So, there was a very heavy burden on people that were used to crossing the border as a very intimate part of their lives. The other interesting thing about the border restrictions is that they lasted well after most domestic restrictions had gone away. So life was sort of back to normal inside of many of our countries, but we were still saying, oh no, we don't want the foreigners coming across the border. In the United States, the last pandemic era restriction, which was also a border restriction, was in place until June of 2023. So that's a really, really long time. I would make the case that using borders to protect public health really came at a high cost. We saw global spread at the end of the day, regardless, because people did continue to move. And the problem on using borders and sort of over-relying on borders during this public health crisis was that it sort of allowed governments to not address the more complex domestic public health needs. This thing is sticky. So why borders? Some of the things I sort of already addressed. Fear and uncertainty really gives way to this feeling like we should pull up the drawbridge. We should protect ourselves from things that are coming from outside the country. Borders were pretty quickly easy to implement border controls. And again, very visible, this kind of political theater of, look, we're showing you that we're protecting you. The government is doing something to protect you. Borders, I would say, were also an attempt to externalize the costs of pandemic control, given inadequate public health capacity in many countries. So the United States was woefully underprepared to deal with the public health emergency that COVID presented. And so we closed our borders. Some other countries, like South Korea is a great example. They had very good contact tracing. They had very strong sort of system for dealing with their public health capacity, never actually closed their border. They just used other mechanisms like quarantine and contact tracing, but they didn't have to resort to border closures. And I think that, keeping foreigners out, whether during COVID or during today, is sort of a politically popular tool, especially if trade continues to move. So if you're still getting the goods you want, in the US, you might remember we had this fear about not getting our toilet paper. You're still getting those goods and you're still getting those things, then there's less sort of pushback against border restrictions. But again, borders aren't just a tool to use against foreigners. They're increasingly restricting the rights and mobilities of citizens and residents. And I say this because we're seeing this today, but I'll get to that later on in the presentation. So I'm going to start by just sharing a few personal stories of people that we interviewed for this book. And I deliberately picked people in other countries because I'll be talking quite a bit about Canada and the US later. I wonder if I need to get closer. Okay. So one such story was in New Zealand. So in New Zealand, about 1 million out of 5 million citizens was actually abroad when New Zealand closed their borders in the spring of 2020. And New Zealand developed this system called managed isolation and quarantine. So basically they had a set number of hotel rooms and seats on planes that you could apply for if you wanted to come back to the country. And it was just a lottery system. Maybe you'd get a seat on the flight home, maybe you wouldn't. And by late 2021, there was over 230,000 New Zealanders living outside of the country who were trying to get home and were unable to secure a spot. So imagine that. You can't even return to your own country. And you're living in this world that's, things are a little scary. There's things shutting down. Maybe you can't leave your home. You want to get back to where you're from. So one of the people that we interviewed who was in this situation was a woman named Charlotte Bellis. And Charlotte was a journalist for Al Jazeera. She was working in Doha and she found out that she was pregnant. And in Doha, it is illegal to be unmarried and to be pregnant. So she was told she had to leave the country. So she tried time and time again to apply for the lottery to come back to New Zealand, stating very clearly that she was pregnant, she was in an unsafe situation, and she was denied. So what she ended up doing, which is pretty wild, is reuniting with her boyfriend in Afghanistan and getting safe passage from the Taliban to go to Afghanistan and have her baby. And she shared a lot of this with the media, and as the media got hold of it, her story went viral, and that changed the situation, and all of a sudden she got a spot in the lottery. But what she told us was, I am a New Zealand passport holder, and I have a legal right to return. The morning we were rejected, I sobbed in my window, overlooking Kabul's snow-covered rooftops. I wasn't triggered by the disappointment and the uncertainty, but by the breach of trust, that in my time of need, the New Zealand government said, you're not welcome. You're not welcome here. When the Taliban offers you a pregnant, unmarried woman safe haven, you know your situation is messed up. So this sounds like a dramatic story, but it was not an isolated event. We interviewed the attorney who represented 250 other pregnant women who were in the same situation as Charlotte, and only about 10% of them were able to return home to have their babies. So a really poignant example of how border controls, again, can really reconfigure the rights and the mobility of citizens and residents. Another interesting example is the border between Norway and Sweden. There's been borderless passport-free travel between Norway and Sweden since 1952. So well before the Schengen system of free movement within Europe, well before the European Union even existed, there was passport-free travel between these two countries. And if you go there, most places you have no idea where the border even is. There's no physical infrastructure, there's no demarcation, it's completely open. And this is a really interesting picture to me because it's called the Peace Monument, and it's very similar to the Peace Arch. Have any of you been to the Peace Arch Park? Some of you, a couple of you. So I'll talk a little bit more about the Peace Arch Park, but it's the same sort of idea where you have this monument of friendship, of peace between two countries that straddles the border itself. So during COVID, you may or may not remember, Sweden had a very unique position throughout Europe where they pursued a herd strategy sort of effect to COVID. So rather than shutting down and closing things like most countries did, they said, we're going to reduce sizing, but we are going to let COVID spread in the hope that people gain herd immunity. So it was a very controversial and different kind of approach. Given that approach, Norway closed their border to Sweden. And it's hard to relay how shocking this was because, again, there wasn't even a physical border necessarily in place. Many people gathered here at the Peace Monument, just like they did at the Peace Arch Park during COVID. You had families on the Norwegian side, on the Swedish side, and it was a very interesting situation because Norwegians could enter Sweden no problem because Sweden did not have border restrictions, but they weren't able to return because there was a quarantine program in place. So as it turns out, so this sort of mundane issue of where the bathroom was ended up being a big deal because the bathroom was on the Swedish side of the parking lot. So there were situations where people had gone across the parking lot to use the bathroom and then would be fined a considerable amount of money upon returning to Norway. But we interviewed many people who lived in this border region, and we spoke to one woman who said, "We haven't had any border for 70 years. Our societies are based on open borders. It's been hard to get the national government authorities to see what effect the border has on us who live here. It felt, at least for the older people, that the border was more closed now than during the Second World War. It caused great harm and sadness among a lot of families. Where I live, they patrolled with guns. You don't see that in Norway. I would never, ever, ever think this would happen." So another example of how these families that straddle borders, particularly in Europe, you have families who might be divorced and you have a parent living on one side of the border and on the other side of the border. And because they have a right to free movement, it's not usually questioned as to whether or not the border will ever be a problem. But in this situation, it was. And we talked to some families whose kids weren't easily able to go back and forth between their parents' houses because of the border restrictions. So that brings me to a situation in the United States called Title 42. Is anybody familiar with this? Maybe Hiroshi. Did Hiroshi talk at all about that? Okay. Anybody want to take a stab at explaining it? Yeah.
Wasn't that the title that said that it was put in place during COVID?
Yep.
And basically it was a protection for United States citizens. You basically sorry.
It's okay. I'm totally putting you on the spot. It was basically, at the time, it was the Trump administration saying that because the asylum system puts migrants in congregate settings, that the asylum process itself created a public health risk because of COVID. So it was, again, sort of using borders as a way to address one issue that had really very little to do with that actual issue, right? This was really about immigration policy. So we interviewed the Centers for Disease Control, not the director, he was like a deputy director, who was supposed to sign this order. And it landed on his desk. And he looked at the order and he said, "I can't sign this. This has nothing to do with public health. This is about immigration and about not wanting to process asylum seekers." So he refused to sign it. And then his boss, who was the director of the CDC, signed it. And it was in place for 3 years, which is, again, a very, very long time. It was the last COVID era measure to be removed in the United States. We had masking measures, we had all these other things. This was the last one to be removed. And it went through a series of legal challenges. And I want to read, I didn't put this on the slide because it's a lot of text, but I just want to read to you one of the opinions that was made by conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch. And he looked at Title 42 and he said, this is something that we should really be concerned about. And he said, doubtless, many lessons can be learned from this chapter in our history, and hopefully serious efforts will be made to study it. One lesson might be this: fear and the desire for safety are powerful forces. They can lead to a clamor for action, almost any action, as long as someone does something to address a perceived threat. The current border crisis is not a COVID crisis, but rather is an emergency decree designed for one crisis in order to address an entirely different one. But if emergency decrees promise to solve some problems, they threaten to generate others. And I want you to really pay attention to this last part. Rule by indefinite emergency edict risks leaving all of us with a shell of a democracy and civil liberties just as hollow. So this was a statement made 2.5 years ago. I did a small book tour and I would read this statement and I would say, look, this is a warning for what we might see in the United States. And I never imagined I'd be standing here in 2025 saying this is actually the situation that we're pretty much facing and living with already. The reality is today we're sort of living in a policy environment that is dominated by executive orders. And those are executive orders that are tied to sort of these emergency situations. And I'll talk about that in a bit, but borders are really playing a central role in all of this. So when we hear this language around crises and emergencies, I just urge you to think about what that means for your own democracy and your own civil liberties, because I would say this is eroding those very, very quickly. So to kind of sum up this section of the talk, looking at borders as political theater during the COVID crisis, I think COVID taught governments in a way that had been far from certain beforehand that borders can be closed or heavily restricted for extended periods with strong public support and minimal disruption to the everyday lives of most citizens. Again, if you're somebody who relies on that border, you work across the border even, or you have family across the border, you're very, very heavily impacted. And many people in Whatcom County were in that situation. The use of borders during COVID laid the groundwork for the expansion of emergency powers in the name of national security that really overrides the democratic process. And I can't stress how much we are seeing that play out today. But it's actually not just here in the US, it's happening in other places as well. So the temptation to use this same approach in future crises, whether it's pandemics or terrorist attacks or asylum seekers, is already proving to be irresistible because restricting borders remains, in quote, in most cases, a good political bet for most leaders. So borders have sort of become a big red button, I think, that policymakers are turning to more and more. This has happened very quickly under the Trump administration, but I would argue that the signs and the sort of groundwork for this were laid well before the election of the second Trump administration. And I won't go too far into other examples from around the world because I don't have the time, but I do just want to point out that we are seeing this very much in Europe as well. In France and Germany, where there is a right to passport-free travel in that Schengen area, we are seeing border controls come and go, and some of them remain in place for a very long period of time under the auspices of national security. France, for example, introduced border controls in 2015 in response to the migrant crisis. They left them in place for so long that when COVID happened in 2020, they basically redefined those same border controls and said, okay, those aren't in place for the migrant crisis anymore. Now they're in place because of COVID. So, clearly this conflation of borders to solve multiple challenges. And right now in Europe, 12 of the 29 member states of that passport-free area have some kind of border controls. So obviously, I think Europe has done a better job in many of these situations than the United States has, but it's far from perfect and it's actually quite problematic. Okay, so now I'm going to shift away from that sort of more global look to look at the politicization of the Canada-US border. And again, I think there's kind of a direct thread from the COVID crisis that kind of set up some of the dynamics that are playing out today. It didn't start under the second Trump administration, but it certainly has been accelerated very quickly. Okay. Oh. Well, now I have a map, so it's actually like something to show you. I'll go for it anyway. So picture a map of the Canada-US border, runs along the 49th parallel where we are, all the way up through Alaska. It's over 5,000 miles long. So the border between Canada and the US is often kind of touted as being the world's longest undefended border. Undefended because there isn't a fence, there isn't a wall, right? There's markers in places, there's border crossings, but it's pretty open feeling in many places. I'm just going to continue because I don't want to run out of time. So what I want to do is read to you, and it doesn't matter, you don't have to see this. I'll read to you two different quotes from two different US presidents describing the Canada-US border and that cross-border relationship. So clear back in 1988, President Reagan said, "Let the 5,000-mile border between Canada and the United States stand as a symbol for the future. No soldier stands guard to protect it. Barbed wire does not deface it. and no invisible barrier of economic suspicion and fear will extend it. Let it forever be not a point of division, but a meeting place between our great and true friends. That was the 1980s. That was a long time ago. That was kind of my childhood. I was an 80s child, which was a wonderful thing to be. But I will say that that sentiment really held. And this is the way that we have, like in my work, talked about the Canada-US border. Okay, great, it's back. As this place where we cooperate, we collaborate, and we can have an open border because of that. Fast forward to earlier this year, and you have President Trump issuing an executive order that says gang members, smugglers, human traffickers, and illicit drugs of all kinds have poured across our borders and into our communities. Canada has played a central role in these challenges, including by failing to devote sufficient attention and resources or meaningfully coordinate with US law enforcement partners to effectively stem the tide of illicit drugs. So how did we get to a place where this narrative around the Canada-US border has so fundamentally shifted? I'm going to tell you this story or explain this to you through a tale of two parks. I'm a geographer, so I like to look at the landscape and think about how does the landscape illustrate broader geopolitical dynamics. So this is the tale of two binational parks. Both of these parks were created as kind of connective spaces to bring people together from both sides of the border. So up top, we have the Peace Arch Park. This was established in 1921. Some of you have seen the arch if you've crossed the border at Blaine. It has this language on it like, may these gates never be closed, brethren dwelling together in unity. Was established to commemorate 100 years of peace between the US and Canada. And in 1971, First Lady Pat Nixon, which is who that is, I looked at the Peace Arch Park and she said, we should have something like this on the US-Mexico border as well. So she went down to Tijuana and San Diego and established Friendship Park. And you probably can't see it very well, but she's shaking the hands of people on the Mexican side and there's a barbed wire fence there. So all that was there was a few strings of barbed wire. And when she was there dedicating the park, she was quoted as saying something like, I sure hope this barbed wire fence won't be here for very long and we have something more like the Peace Arch Park. Well, of course, we know probably that that never actually happened. Have any of you visited Friendship Park? You've probably seen it in pictures. It's this classic park where the wall goes all the way out into the ocean. There's a lot of great border artwork down there. The Tijuana side is a really fun area. The US side is pretty boring. And there used to be an area in here that was very controlled. It's like you're standing in a cage where you could actually be together from both sides of the border. And you contrast that with the Peace Arch Park, which is a very open space. I'll talk about this in a little bit. You used to be able to come from both sides and share space. You still can, but it's changed over the last couple years. But very different environments. And I used to compare these parks and say, you know, these spaces reflect these broader geopolitics, these cross-border spaces. And unfortunately, what's really sad is they're both sort of dwindling and sort of slipping away from us in terms of their original intent. The Friendship Park is closed. It's been closed since COVID. I'm almost positive it hasn't opened up again, so it's not accessible at all. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit some of the changes that we've seen at Peace Arch Park, which were very surprising to me. So well, you can kind of see these. COVID in the park was called the Summer of Love. And this was called the Summer of Love because the Peace Arch Park, it turned out, was the only place that people could be together from both sides of the Canada-US border during the pandemic. So people were coming from all over the US, all over Canada to be together in this space. This was a couple that did not want to wait for the uncertainty of the pandemic to pass to get married, so they got married right in the park. She's standing on the US side, he's standing on the Canadian side. The woman in the middle is the director of the Peace Arch Park Association. She came up with this term, the Summer of Love. She had all these like t-shirts and swag around the Summer of Love. The tents down here were couples who were otherwise separated by the border who would set up tents in the park, and it was the only place, again, that they could be together. And this picture on the far right of the Zwidmere family is a very compelling story about a man named Bill who had terminal cancer and wanted to say goodbye to his grandson who was in Canada and he was in the US. They were able to meet at the park. And this was the last time he was able to be with his family before he passed away. So this park had incredible meaning, not just during COVID, but for the 100 years that it had existed in this way that allowed people to come together. And I think it kind of symbolized the broader Canada-US relationship, which is we can have these open spaces because we trust each other and we work together very hard to maintain them. So all of this started to change during COVID, partly because so many people were coming to the park that there was an increase in some illicit activities, some human smuggling, some irregular migration. And what we started to see was this restriction of park access. And again, this is just a park, but we could think about it as symbolizing that broader relationship. So US Customs and Border Protection started to put up signs saying, you can no longer access the park at this spot. And a lot of this was due to this concern about increased illegal crossings. Then we started to see things like this. This is a screenshot I took from the Facebook site of Border Patrol saying, this isn't an entrance. You can't enter the park here at all anymore. And finally, Border Patrol started actually checking people's documents. So if you go up there today to the park, you may or may not be asked, you probably won't, but you might be asked about if you have your documents. Yeah.
Like agents that they're like by a bathroom, and they have like guns, and this is the first time I've ever seen like gun like agents there, and they were like, "What? Where can we go? Can we like go over and look at the border?" It's like, yeah, you just can't step over, and it's like an open, like they're
yeah, it's just a ditch actually between the Canadian side and the US side, and for 100 years you could walk across the ditch, and the idea was you have to come back from the side that you came from. You can't, cross the border there. But it worked well. And there's always been patrolling. There's always been cameras to ensure that situation. But the level of aggressiveness is something we've never seen before. And it's not just the US, the Canadian side as well. Royal Canadian Mounted Police have increased their patrols and are also apprehending people more and more. So I bring up this example because Canada and the US in this one sort of microcosm faced a challenge, right? We had a challenge of increased irregular border crossings, but we didn't work together to solve that. We could have collaborated on that issue. We've done so in the past. And instead, coming out of COVID, we sort of started to go our different ways. That collaboration started to fray, particularly on the border. Because something I should add also is during COVID, Canada and the US had very different border policies related to COVID. So again, I used to sort of compare this to Friendship Park as this wonderful thing we have up here. That's not what it is on the southern border. And unfortunately, they seem to sort of be converging. But I do think that the changes that we saw in the park reflect the broader changes to the Canada-US relationship. We did see this post-COVID shift in the rhetoric, that way we describe the border and this kind of politicization of the border. So I talked about Title 42, right? That was prevented people from claiming asylum in the US. There was also a very large drop in migration worldwide during COVID for obvious reasons. So after COVID, this is showing monthly migrant encounters at the Canadian border. We would expect a surge, right? There was this sort of pent up demand and there was a surge in border crossings, but it did start to drop down actually fairly quickly. But the damage was done. And we started to see reports coming out in the media that there was terrorists coming across the border from Canada. We started to seeing talk during the lead up to the presidential election and to the Republican nomination in particular, that Republicans were starting to talk about building a wall on the northern border, which this is, again, something that really didn't exist in the narrative before, maybe a little bit during the first Trump administration, but nobody took that seriously, I wouldn't say. So we have people like Nikki Haley, if you remember who she was. She was a Republican nominee for, she ran against Donald Trump. And she started talking about building a wall on the northern border, saying, we don't talk enough about the northern border. We'll do whatever we have to on the northern border. So pretty quickly coming out of COVID and leading up to the presidential election, there was this kind of seizing on the Canadian border as a national security threat. And that, I would argue, is fed very much into what we're seeing today in terms of the executive orders that the Trump administration is issuing. So I used a little bit of this language when I quoted Trump before. I don't really enjoy quoting Donald Trump, to be honest, but I think sometimes those direct words are really important to pay attention to. So for the executive order, you probably heard about tariffs, the tariffs against Canada, the tariffs worldwide. This executive order issued in February was directly aimed at the northern border and said this failure to act on the part of Canada constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat. And I want you to remember the words unusual and extraordinary. Those are very specifically put in there. To the national security and foreign policy of the United States, I hereby declare and reiterate a national emergency to deal with that threat. And then the executive order goes on to say, this national emergency requires decisive, immediate action, and I have decided to impose tariffs to address this unusual and extraordinary threat. Pretty creative, right? But a bit of a stretch if you think about if there actually was an unusual and extraordinary threat related to crime and drugs, how on earth are tariffs going to be something that address that? But it was very creative by the Trump administration and brings us to something that we're facing today, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. I'm not a trade expert. I won't bore you with too much trade stories or detail, but by using this term, unusual and extraordinary threat, the Trump administration was able to tap into this law, this act, which is from the 1970s, which doesn't actually allow a president to levy tariffs, but what it does do is say that a president can regulate certain international economic transactions that threaten a national security during national crises and emergencies. So what the Trump administration did was they declared a fentanyl emergency and they imposed tariffs against Canada, Mexico, and China, saying there's too much fentanyl coming in from these countries. It's an emergency, so we're going to use this act to address it. Then they used a US trade deficit emergency to impose reciprocal tariffs worldwide. This has been ruled illegal by the International Trade Court, and this illegality was upheld recently by a federal appeals court. Today, right now, the Supreme Court is hearing this case. So there are major implications that are going to come out of what the Supreme Court decides as to whether or not a US president has the power to declare an emergency and implement tariffs under this statute. I think at the end of the day, what the Supreme Court rules will really be about the boundaries of executive power amid these national emergencies. I don't know when the ruling will come out, but it's been expedited. And again, today is the day that they are hearing that case. So I'm going to kind of wrap up and just bring us to where we are today, talk a little bit about the collateral damage that we here in Whatcom County are sort of facing because of these broader border politics, because of the use of borders as this sort of political theater and this policy tool to address, again, issues that have very little to do with actual borders. So the Trump administration has levied tariffs on Canada, accused them of playing a central role in our fentanyl crisis, framed this shared border as a national security threat, and that's just sort of the surface of what we're facing in Canada-US relations. I also always want to make the sort of statement about why the border matters. Some of you may never cross the border. You think, oh, it doesn't really matter to me. I don't go to Canada. But our cross-border relationships influence us in many, many ways that may not seem obvious. One is travel and tourism. The Bellingham Public Airport, 60% of their passengers are Canadian. So that's why we have routes to places like Phoenix and Vegas and Palm Springs and all of these really sunny, warm places. If fewer Canadians are crossing the border, we have less airport activity, which impacts us, right? Our tourism sector is pretty heavily dependent on Canadians. There's lots of different examples of why travel and tourism and that Canadian relationship impact our economy. We trade about $18 billion across our land border crossings with British Columbia every year. We also have these really integrated and innovative ways that we work together to build things. So I love to give this example. It's the world's first commercial electric seaplane built by a company in Victoria, Canada, with an engine part from a company in Everett. So a great example of how when we work together across the border, we often can do more than what we could do alone. Of course, we have this shared natural environment, the Salish Sea, the health of that ecosystem. Doesn't make sense to manage it on one side because what you do on the other side is going to have a really significant impact. So the more we can align how we protect that environment, the more success we will have in doing so. Disaster response is a really, really important component of our cross-border relationship. This is a picture from almost exactly 4 years ago of the Nooksack River floods. The Nooksack River, of course, originates in the US, but when it floods into Canada. So obviously both countries have to be at the table to figure out how to manage that response. Doing things like forest fires and other natural disasters that really require us to work together to be successful. And then finally, again, just those families and friends and loved ones whose lives span the border in very intimate ways and really depend on being able to move back and forth across that border. So what's happening now? I could talk all day about the shifting Canada-US border relationship, but I won't. I'll just sum it up by saying, have any of you familiar with the Elbows Up Canada effort? So this is in response to the Trump administration tariffs imposed on Canada, but also in response to comments that the president repeatedly made around Canada becoming the US 51st state. I think in the United States, it's easier for us to just sort of roll our eyes. This is, you know, a silly thing for the president to say, but for Canadians, it's not funny. It's an attack on their sovereignty. So there's been this pretty well formed effort throughout Canada that's sort of a hockey phrase, elbows up Canada. Let's not travel to the US. Let's not buy US goods. It's really a boycott of the United States. This is also filtered down even to the regional level. This is the Premier of British Columbia, David Eby. He's encouraged both government and business to cut off all ties with the US, even with those of us here in Washington. So even those regional relationships, which have been strong, are being very much fractured. And then finally, there's the border itself. There's been a lot of fear around crossing the border. There's been kind of some high profile stories of people being detained at the US border and a lot of fear around crossing the border and even just being in the US right now as well. So the loss of trust with our allies and our neighbors impacts our quality of life in many ways that I think can't actually be measured, whether you ever cross the border or not. And you know, it's going to be very difficult to repair that trust because, as you know, in personal relationships, trust takes a lot of time to build up, but it can break down very quickly. So what's the answer? I don't think it's limits to executive power. We approach this in our book, and you know, I will be surprised if the Supreme Court sides against the Trump administration, because in issues of national security, in issues of national emergency, the judicial usually sides with the executive. So the president has very broad powers in that regard. I think the answer is probably just simply bringing people together in whatever way is possible. So I'm going to wrap up with the story of Paul Robeson and Peace Arch Park. Has anybody ever heard Paul Robeson? One person, okay. So he was a singer in the 1940s, very successful singer. He was also a member of the Communist Party. And in the early 1950s, the US State Department tried to force him to sign an affidavit admitting that he was a communist, which at the time would have had some serious implications. He refused to do so, so they revoked his passport. At the time, he had a series of concerts planned in Canada. He was not able to travel to Canada, not because he needed a passport to enter Canada, because you didn't at the time, but because the US actually put outbound controls and stopped him as he was crossing in Blaine to go to Vancouver. So what he did was something really creative. He said, okay, well, if I can't go to Canada, I'll have a concert in the Peace Arch Park. So he stood on the back of a flatbed truck. You can sort of see him there. And he gave a concert to about 35,000 to 40,000 people on both sides of the border. 6 years later, the Supreme Court ruled that a passport of a US citizen cannot be withheld because of their political beliefs. This did not used to be the case. There's a lot of parallels to what we're seeing today. Political beliefs are becoming more and more of a border issue. This affects Canadians at the border. I've talked to a lot of Canadians who've told me that as they were crossing the border, they were actually asked what their views on the Trump administration were. But again, it also affects us as citizens, but even more so as residents, people who are worried about leaving the country, who might have legal status in the US, but they're worried about being able to return because of their political beliefs or something else that might be found out on social media. So this kind of comes back to those civil liberties that we are sort of quickly losing grasp of in the United States, and how we're all sort of more vulnerable at the border. But I do think the Paul Robeson story is an inspiring example of how we can overcome politicization, which is particularly acute at the border. In Robeson's case, it was music that brought people together, but there's of course other things. There's a lot of work happening right now related to cross-border collaboration on the Salish Sea ecosystem environment to try to maintain that work that's been done. A very small little example is something that's been sporadically happening again at the Peace Arch Park, which is called Handshakes Across the Border, and it's Canadians and Americans just coming together and shaking hands, that simple. So there's still these efforts out there. So in conclusion, in a post-pandemic world, restricting borders is increasingly normalized and I would say misused. And this is not just in the United States, but I think we're the strongest example of that. Crises grant governments virtually unlimited ability to declare emergencies and weaponize borders to weaken the mobility and civil liberties of their own residents. And this is very much the moment that we are living in today. Everyday diplomacy and cross-border collaboration are more important than ever before. They're sort of the only things that I can come up to that are a bit of an antidote to what's happening at our federal government. So I'm going to close and just leave this on the screen. We are doing a border survey. We did one this summer where we take Western students up to the Canada-US border and we stop people as they're crossing and we ask them a variety of questions. Where's your residency? Where you're going? What's your trip purpose? This is a collaboration between the US and Canada, British Columbia and Washington State. It's a project we do every 5 years to try to understand our cross-border flows. So we did it in the summer and we're going to do it again in the winter. It's really fun. The students have a good time. It's hard work because you are outside on your feet and this will be in the winter. But if you're interested, please take a screenshot of the QR code, or you can follow up with Jennifer Bettis, who is my program manager, who will be hiring for that pretty soon. So that's it from me. I hope you have questions or comments, or if there's anything I can clarify, let me know.
Thank you. Questions? How do you see the situation at the north border progressing throughout the presidency? Like, do you see it getting more strict and harsh?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's so hard to say because I will say that since winter and spring and the elbows up movement that I showed, that's kind of cooled down a little bit. Canadians have moved on a bit from feeling very angry and very betrayed by the United States. Every time it starts to feel like maybe we'll slowly start to get back to normal, the Trump administration throws something else out there. So just last week, I think it was last week, there was an ad that was run by the Premier of Ontario citing Ronald Reagan, saying Reagan was anti-tariffs, and that pissed off Donald Trump. And he said, I'm not having trade talks with Canada. So it's really hard to say because they could start to feel like they're getting back to normal. And then there's this just oddball curve that gets thrown in there. I do think that the Canadian government is, they're pivoting away from the United States trade-wise. They're trying to sign trade deals with Europe and other countries. I think there's a recognition that this close relationship with the United States has hurt them and they're not interested in going back to it. That's my sense.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Were the restrictions on the Peace Arch Park put during the Biden or the Trump administration?
That was during the Biden administration. Yes. So I do like to point out, it's easy for us to blame everything on Trump, but those were happening under the Biden administration. Yeah. And I would say Title 42 stayed in place under the Biden administration as well. So.
Hi, I was wondering in towns that I don't know the names of these specific towns, but I know there's towns or cities where you have to cross from the US into Canada to get back into the US to get to these towns. Is there tension between towns that are so close where you have to kind of cross one border to get back to your country to get to that town?
Yeah, so there's about 4 of those.
Yeah.
One of them is in Canada. 3 of them are in the US. I can only really speak to Point Roberts, which is the one that's actually in Whatcom County. So if you cross the border at Blaine, you drive 25 minutes through Canada, and then you cross back into the US. It's like this little nub on a peninsula. And they were really decimated during COVID, of course, because they could kind of travel through Canada to get down to Bellingham, but they were kind of trapped, many of them. So they were still recovering from COVID when all of this happened. And yeah, they've seen their border crossing numbers drop to the same extent than most other places have, which is interesting because many Point Roberts residents are actually Canadian citizens. They have dual citizenship. So I think they were hoping that Canadians would not necessarily see Point Roberts as American, but as this sort of like quasi-American Canadian space. But they've pretty much felt the same lack of visitation that many other places have. And it's more impactful to them because they're so much more dependent on that cross-border travel. And I will say too, like places like Blaine, I mean, I've heard stories from people that have, say, like they're coming from the US and their kids play sports on a Canadian team being harassed. Like unpleasant things that you wouldn't expect between neighbors, particularly when you're talking about kids on sports teams, like totally apolitical. So for a while there was a lot of tension, I think, even in the border communities. I do think that's cooled down a little bit.
Other questions?
Hello. So I had seen you briefly touched on like interactions between like border patrol and people crossing the borders when it comes to like political affiliation. I'm just wondering if like you had any more details about like the consequences or like anything they had to go through if they did talk about like disliking Trump.
Yeah, so like I have colleagues up at DHS, like high levels that I work with, and I tell them these things are happening and they're like, no, that's totally not allowed, right? You're not supposed to be asking people their political affiliations at the border, but it is happening because we're seeing it. So the challenge is, and this isn't just US, this is Canadian as well, like a border officer has so much discretion at the border that they kind of can do what they want, right? They can ask you questions that they want, and they can ask you those questions because they always have a veil of national security, right? There's always this sort of premise that, well, this is a national security issue at the border. So the typical civil liberties don't actually apply in that environment. So, you know, if you're a US citizen and you're anti-Trump and you've got it all over your social media, we've seen some cases like this in the news. We're seeing a little bit more sort of harassment involved in that. Now, there's no sort of, like, they can't really detain you from entering your own country. You do have a right to enter the United States. If you're not a citizen, that's where it becomes very, very tricky. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of issues, not just at the border, but within the US as well, right? Where your political beliefs can actually be used as a way to deport you from the country, even if you're here legally. So it's definitely becoming more messy. I think if you actually like went through like the legal process, you'd see much of this is completely unconstitutional and illegal, but there's so many legal battles out there right now that it's hard to say how these things will get resolved. Yeah.
Hi. Would you say that there's any good to be had from border control in any aspect, in issues of national security or trade or anything like that?
Good question. It's a good challenging question. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't believe in a borderless world. I don't think that's realistic. I think we have to have some ways to regulate the flow of people and the flow of goods. In some ways, having borders can create more secure environments because, you know, trade is a good example. I mean, if you're not regulating trade, then you're not sort of protecting industries. I mean, it's all about protectionism. We can pretend like we have free trade, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of protectionism there. I don't think that open borders or borderless world is an answer. And this is maybe very cynical on my part, but I sort of feel like at the end of the day, humans have this need for boundaries. And we have this need to feel like there's this space that is sort of ours. And if we take that away, when I was doing my dissertation, I quoted this old political scientist, Michael Walzer, who said, in the absence of walls are 1,000 petty fortresses. So like we will always find ways to sort of delineate that space and who we think belongs or what we think belongs in it and what doesn't. And having those national borders is one way to do that for better or for worse. I know I'm not really giving you a good direct answer, but there are illicit flows that move through the world, right? Like there is fentanyl. There's fentanyl coming from China. There is not much, but there is some fentanyl coming from Canada, and borders are a way to stop those things from moving. So there is a function there that I think is useful, but limited, I'll say.
Hello, hi.
Hey.
So I was in the, so to that point, I was in the, I was in Germany and I crossed over the border into the Netherlands. And I remember falling asleep in the car and we crossed over the border and I didn't even know. So like there was no like border protection there. So to that point, I'm just wondering how that even happened, or how does that operate with like speaking to like fentanyl or like
Yeah.
drug trafficking like that, or just the need for borders? How does that happen in the EU and how does that continue to work?
Yeah, so I think there's two components, well, three maybe. So not all of the Schengen states are in the European Union, but most of them are. So there's a common market there. So the sort of that issue of commerce is less of a factor, regulating commerce. I think a lot of it comes down to trust. Those countries have come together and they trust each other, but you can't have passport-free movement within Europe without having borders on the outside of Europe. And there's sort of this idea around Fortress Europe, and there's something called Frontex, which is the European border controls. So when the migrant flows were increasing in 2014 and 2015, we saw internal border controls come up, but we also saw the external borders of Europe become more and more built up. So you sort of can't have internal movement without that external movement. And really, in theory, North America could do the same thing, right? We could say, we don't want to have borders between the United States and Mexico and Canada, but you're going to have borders south of Mexico because otherwise you're opening it up to Central America and other places. So during COVID, it was interesting because the European Commission tried to take the stance of saying, we are going to maintain free movement within Europe because we're going to have this fortress Europe. So we're not going to let people in and out of Europe. And that's going to allow us to maintain this internal movement, which is so important to European identity, to families, to the economy. But actually what happened was those countries still put up border controls. So I would say that it's a great system when it works, but it's a very vulnerable system because at the end of the day, countries still want to have control over their borders. Yeah, and many European countries, like they have more than just one border, right? They're surrounded by 3 or 4 or 5 other European countries. So I do think that has quite a bit to do with it. They're much more dependent on each other. Like the US is so huge that we operate, very autonomously, really. I mean, we have trade relations with Canada and Mexico and other countries, but we're not as dependent on them as I think some of those European countries are. But also there's just a vision and an identity there that there's enough of a commonality in those countries, and maybe it is because they're smaller and they're so close together to other countries, that identity, that European identity, which I will say is very challenged at times and is challenged right now, can create that open space. But yeah, I mean, think about it. If Washington's not a great idea, but if you were in the middle of the US in, I don't know, Kentucky or somewhere, and you had 5 different states around you that were actually countries, I mean, there's a lot of interaction and a lot of movement, whereas, we're very isolated here in the US.
Going back to like her question, what is inspiring like border patrol to ask about people's like political beliefs? Like what good would that do?
Intimidation, I think. I won't pretend to know like the inner workings of border protection or border patrol, but I do know there has been a directive that's sort of encouraging enhanced screening. That's like the only policy relevant thing that I'm aware of. But I think it is a lot more just sort of an intimidation factor. Because yeah, there isn't, you know, at the end of the day, there's very little repercussion that can really be had from people's political beliefs.
Like if they were maybe maybe listen and go into the US? Like are they?
I don't know if that's happened. I have heard anecdotal stories that may or may not hold weight that people who had Nexus cards, so Nexus is like the TSA pre-check at the land border, you apply for it, you get expedited passage. If you go back and forth across the border, it's like this really great card to have because you go much more quickly. And I have heard of stories of Nexus card holders being asked their political beliefs and then getting their cards revoked when they, you know, said something against the Trump administration. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's been sort of there may or may not have been people that have been refused entry, but it would be possible because of the discretion of officers at the border could say, I don't like what you're saying about the Trump administration. I think you could be a national security threat, so I'm not going to allow you entry. Like certainly that would be possible. I don't know if it's happened in that way or not.
Directing border patrol to ask this political question.
I'm guessing it's the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirsti Noem. She would be the main boss. And if you have seen her, she's very aggressive, right? She's been very aggressive with ICE and with deportations. Department of Homeland Security is huge. It involves a number of different agencies. Customs and Border Protection is just one. But she's been taking a very aggressive stance. She actually went into, I was going to provide this example of how citizens have kind of pushed back against some of this stuff. There's a library in Vermont called Stansted, and it's called the Haskell Free Public Library. Again, been there for 100 years, and it spans the Canada-US border. So you could go into that library from the Canadian side or the US side, and there's a little sort of strip along the ground that shows the international border, and people like jump across it, you know, and it's this fun thing. And Kirsti Noem visited it, I don't know when that was, last spring, maybe last winter. And she decided that she didn't like that library being so open because people could be smuggling drugs through the middle of the library or doing these other illicit activities. So she said, you can no longer enter this library from the Canadian side. You have to come into the US and enter it from the US side. So the community there did a GoFundMe campaign and raised enough money to build a ramp so that you could leave Canada, go up the ramp and like go into the building from the US side, which I think is just like a fantastic kind of way to overcome that kind of division. But you know, not everybody has the resources to do that. But yeah, she's been quite aggressive in, you know, upending things that have been in existence for 100 years.
Talk a little bit about Title 42 and how the Trump got during COVID, how climate change continues it. I was just kind of wondering what kind of powers that gives border patrol and to border patrol agents, and are those powers still used today, or are they still used as like methods?
Another really good question. At the time, there basically was there was no processing of asylum claims, which is kind of what's happening now, right? So you could present yourself at the border and usually there was a due process and Border Patrol agents had to bring you in and you went through a court process. Maybe you were detained in the meantime. Now at that time, they were just turning people around. And what ended up happening is there was a lot of recidivism. So people kept trying to come back. And so the numbers looked really high of encounters, but actually it was a lot of the same people trying to come back. And during Biden administration, they started to put in place an actual process for asylum claims that was not the same as just sort of this encounter at the border. You could use an app. It was called CBP-1, and you could apply for your asylum sort of entry, and you were granted a time and a location, and it was starting to become sort of actually a managed process versus this, it's kind of like not a very good process before that. That ended with the Trump administration, and we're basically back to where we were, where asylum claims are just not being processed. There's a little bit of a different policy mechanism now with that. But yeah, I mean, we're violating our own sort of commitment to, people have a right to claim asylum when they enter the United States because we're just turning them away. So I don't know that it's actually all that different. But you could see how Trump 1.0, being the architect of Title 42, really liked that idea of just saying, like, I'm going to solve this problem by just turning people around. It's basically what they're doing now, just under a different policy mechanism. Yeah.
I was just wondering if there's any sort of repercussions for local agents who are very when people from.
Good. You guys have really good questions. I don't think so. You could have a very good port director, which is sort of like the local boss, reprimand those agents. Maybe they demote them. That's probably happened in places where the port director is more concerned with actually doing the job of letting people in and like cross back and forth than about the politics. But there is a lot of immunity for Border Patrol agents, and there's a really good book that is going to come out soon that was written by professor in Hawaii and a law expert here in Bellingham. And it's a story of a man up in Blaine, actually, who, it's a very long story, I won't get into details, but he was pushed by a Border Patrol agent in his own yard because he was accused of human trafficking. And he fell down and he incurred some injuries. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the question was, can a Border Patrol agent be sued for violating somebody's civil liberties in the border zone, right? Because you should be able to stand in your own driveway, and if somebody pushes you over, you should be able to sue them for injuries. And the Supreme Court ruled that no, because it's in this border zone of national security, they cannot be held accountable in the same way that they otherwise would. That was just a couple years ago, maybe. So it gives you a little bit of the flavor for that kind of immunity in those environments. And that's going to be a really good book when it comes out. Maybe we can get the authors to speak here, because it's a really fascinating story about kind of civil liberties in the border zone that happened right here in Blaine. So.
Question?
I sort of would like to get back to the future that we had before it was derailed. I think Canada and the United States had worked very well together. We were doing some very interesting things. Has anybody ever taken the train from Vancouver to Bellingham, across the border? So it stops at the border. There's this weird process. Any day now, it will be announced that that train no longer has to stop at the border because we have this integrated way of managing that flow. We were doing interesting things together. We were innovating together. And I think in many instances, border security was less about this traditional notion of security and more about, what do our communities and our economies need to be secure? How do we secure those flows so they can move back and forth? I don't know that we'll ever get back there because, again, it involves a lot of trust. I think there's still a lot of kind of on the ground, nitty-gritty cross-border relationships that are pretty much the way they were. But in terms of a broader collaborative vision, that feels pretty broken. So I would love to get back to a place where we trust each other, we feel like we're friends and we're allies, and we are working towards making that border work better, thinning that border, not making it as much of an impediment as it's becoming. Maybe in 3.5 years, we'll be able to go there. But again, I think trust, once broken, takes a very long time to repair. So unfortunately, I'm not overly optimistic right now, but I think in our region, we probably have the best prospects to try to build up those relationships again, because we do have a lot of people and initiatives and program. My institute is just one of a number of different efforts to try to kind of maintain those cross-border relations. So back to the future.
Thank you. Our time is up, so please let's thank Dr. Trautman for our presentation.
Thanks, guys.